Welcome to Public Affairs Roundtable, a discussion of current events in the nation and around the world and how they affect the people of Indiana. Here's your moderator, Larry Lough.
Today we'll look at 1985, the good times, the bad times. What does 1985 mean to history as it is? We'll get those opinions today on the issues of 1985, perhaps dust off the crystal ball, look into 86 a little bit, with three Ball State University professors. They are Cecil Bohannon from economics, Bill Mosier from marketing, and John Rouse from the Department of Political Science. John, is 1985 anything to remember, just a blip on the screen of history, or is it perhaps a benchmark year for certain issues, certain people?
Oh, I think it's just the evolution of the past, but I would say that there are a couple of things that have been crystallized during '85. First of all, there was an article written in the New York Times Magazine in February of '84 that talked about the election of 1984 becoming an ideological election. And that just hasn't happened, because I would say the first thing we could look at is the fact that the welfare state is intact. In other words, all the entitlement middle-class programs have not been eliminated. What you have found is retrenchment from some of those programs. So that's the first theme, I think, that has crystallized since in the past year. So in terms of the result of that program is that what has happened is that the Democrats across the country have come to accept less spending. But the Republicans, in terms of the theme, are coming to accept government. And I don't know which one is more important, but I think those are two kinds of things we can look at. The other focus in terms of '85 is the Gramm-Rudman proposal. And basically, this is a theme in terms of crystallizing the swing of political influence away from the Congress, which occurred during Vietnam, to an emphasis upon the White House's political power. So I think that's another thing we can look at. Now, in terms of looking at '86, I think the thing we can look at in terms of a general focus is that for the first time in some times, all these politicians, Republicans and Democrats, are going to be running without Reagan. And we have 34 Senate seats up for election. Approximately 22 of those are Republicans. 16 of those Republicans ran for the first time 6 years ago. Something in politics called the 6-year itch is coming up in '86. So the 6-year itch, the focus of political power back to the White House from Congress, and the fact that the welfare state is going to be with us for some time.
But isn't it interesting, Gramm-Rudman, if you look at it on the surface of it, what it really says is that Congress has to make the tough decision of cutting back some programs. That essentially what you said is absolutely true. The fraction of gross national product that the federal government absorbs is the same today as it was at the beginning of the Reagan administration. So the Reagan revolution has really been what? It's been not cutting back the size of government, but keeping government from growing more exorbitantly than it already would have been growing anyway. So there's not been any cut there. But isn't what Gramm-Rudman says is that Congress has to get its act together one way or another and essentially cut back some programs. And if it doesn't, what is going to happen is automatically the burden will be placed on the president to cut back all programs in a uniform fashion. Now, to the extent I don't think the president's going to do that, what's going to be the bottom line? What's going to occur when, as early as March, these budget cuts have to be mandated by the provision of the bill?
Yeah, a couple of things we could look at. First of all, in the last 4 or 5 years, that domestic spending has been lowered by $75 to $80 billion. All right. If you look at Gramm-Rudman, you have to ask the question, why is it called a sham? And that's my question for you, Cecil.
Well, isn't the point, under Gramm-Rudman, what you have to do in order to make the legislation effective is Congress or a coalition in Congress or the president has to say that certain middle-class entitlement programs aren't going to just be pared back. We're not just going to get rid of waste and fraud, but we're going to eliminate those programs. The Small Business Administration, kaput. The Department of Energy, no more. That's the decision that has to be made under Gramm-Rudman. Now, that's what the attempt, I think, Gramm-Rudman's trying to force the legislators and the president to do I'm not at all optimistic that it's going to be terribly successful, because the political forces that kept it from being done in the absence of Gramm-Rudman are still going to be there. And the way the bill is worded, there are all kinds of ways to loophole.
And are going on right now. I mean, we have things right now. The example is
every 5 minutes it gets amended again.
In other words, the continuing resolution process and this sort of thing. Though right now they really are having trouble coming to grips with this. Why is it going to be better 4, 5, 6 months from now than it is now, I guess, is a question in my mind.
Well, in terms of the political impacts of this issue, the fact that the power is going back to the White House, the Congress has not been able to get its act together as a policy-making body in the last 12 years. And so this is the admitting by Congress that we can't get our act together. And so what it allows is the process of impoundment by the White House. Now, this was a big issue in the early 70s with the Nixon administration. Impoundments were not allowed. Mm-hmm. And then there was that focus of the legislative veto. Of course, that's been declared illegal by the Supreme Court. Mm-hmm. So what has really happened since Vietnam and since Watergate, which were the watershed kinds of things in terms of national politics, mm-hmm. is that Congress finally says, hey, it's your job, Mr. President, you cut the money out.
But do you see that, John, see that changing Congress back to being more structured and less of the individualism that we've had? Is it going as a defensive response to regain some of that power and that sort of thing? You see it moving back to more the way that it was before all the fractionalization that happened within Congress?
Well, you can't put Humpty Dumpty back together again, but I think it's really as I said, the fact that Congress admits that it's difficult to have 435 plus 100 people make foreign policy, especially, and also domestic policy. It's not that the White House has all the answers. It's just simply that Congress doesn't have the answers.
The White House doesn't have the pluralism that Congress has, basically.
Sure.
Right, yeah.
In interest and that sort of thing.
Of course, if you think about it, Ronald Reagan never submitted a balanced budget, nor did he ever get any budget that was radically different from what he wanted. Isn't Gramm-Rudman, in some sense, a way for Congress to point their finger at the president and say it's his fault, and the way for the president to point his finger at Congress and say it's their fault, and both of them to be able to come out on the record as saying they're for a balanced budget? Yeah, it's a politically ingenious device, but in some sense perhaps meaningless.
There's no sense of political responsibility in this Gramm-Rudman thing.
Well, in terms of budget, in terms of bureaucracy, in terms of Washington legislation, we're not where Ronald Reagan thought we would be or said we would be in 1985 and 86, are we? We're really nowhere close.
Now, to point that out, Larry, let me ask Cecil this question. Cecil, in 81, fiscal 81, government spending absorbed 23.5% of the gross national product. Projected in 86, government is to absorb 23.3% of the gross national product.
Right. Nothing's changed.
Okay, that's all.
But nothing's changed.
But there's
been changes in distribution. Admittedly, entitlements to the poor have been cut marginally. Entitlements to the middle class, a very sensitive political constituency, haven't been changed. And of course, that's where changes have to come. But any savings that have been obtained by cutting back certain entitlements to the poor, of course, have been offset by increases in Pentagon spending. Now, what's interesting about Gramm-Rudman, however, is it does sort of freeze any further cuts to the poor, and says, according to the definition of the way it operates, the cuts are going to have to come out of the Pentagon, and they would have to come out of middle-class entitlements. Now, it's interesting to see
whether
which has
traditionally been tremendously resisted by the president.
And so what I expect is perhaps some of that will occur. Maybe Gramm-Rudman won't be that bad. But what I would expect is there's going to be ways for them to exempt certain things even further. There's ways to change the legislation. Another interesting thing is if they can always get the department and the government to project what the budget deficits are going to do to fudge the figures a little bit, that will help. There's games they can play.
Well,
there's no cure-all.
One example of that is, in other words, they have an inflationary factor built into the military budget for particular major expenditures. So what they do is they spread it out. In other words, they load more of it at the far end.
They just do accounting. They just do some accounting.
This has already happened to some degree.
What has happened, of course, is that the Democrats have agreed to protect the Defense Department. The Republicans have agreed to protect Medicare and Social Security.
Right.
And everybody else is out there still fighting for their little piece of the action.
Everybody's covered. Was 1985 a year of change at all? Did we see any great evolution and even in consumerism?
Well, Larry, I'd say that 1985 was a year that you see a change in what some of the issues are. I don't think you see a major change in terms of the status of the consumer. I think for example, 85 was the 20th anniversary of the publication of Ralph Nader's Unsafe at Any Speed, which was really what got him very widely recognized. Actually, I remember talking to someone at the time that it was originally, he was a testifying for the Congress, and he gave testimony, and then he went out and he published or wrote and published the book, and then he went back as an expert witness and got a lot more credibility the second time a year later when he was in testifying, and he really carried a lot more impact. Net result, today we have auto recalls that are really rather institutionalized. In other words, if you look back, it was something that was tremendously resisted by the automotive companies at the time of the Corvair and all that sort of thing. Today, it's something it's a fact of life. It is something that's done rather automatically, bureaucratically. It's built into the structure. But we also have some changes that I think are very significant in terms of what the consumer situation is and in terms of marketers in relationship to that. And one that we're all very much aware of by the news right now is the issue of airlines and the fact that the airlines went through deregulation, and then we have 85 being a year that was really a bad year in terms of the accident rate. And you get into all sorts of very tough questions. In other words, are they cutting back, for example, on their maintenance levels because a number of them really were losing money? And so you try to figure out whether they are literally taking a chance with people's lives in the process. But you also look at the fact that we were experiencing an improving situation after deregulation from 78 through 84, because we actually went down from, the figure I remember seeing was we went down from 100 accidents per 100,000 departures, something like that, down to 34, some tremendous improvement. I have not seen final figures on 85, but
then why the drastic change in 85? Why was it such a tragic year for the airline industry?
I really think that there are a number of things involved, and I think it's more complex than any particular thing. And I think we have to look, for example, if you look at it, you have to look at it worldwide. You have to look at even though we are deregulated, I think there's still probably better maintenance that's going on in most of the U.S. Airlines than in some of the airlines in other parts of the world. And you have to sort that out and decide how much of that is part of why it was a terrible year. And you also have something that's very different if we look at the very recent tragedy involving in Newfoundland, because that did involve a charter plane and that sort of thing.
I've got a question for you business types, as we say in political science. If you look at the three groups, consumers, labor, and business, can you tell us which of those groups is prospering in terms of the 1980s and which groups are not doing as well? Labor, organized labor on one end, business management on another end, and somewhere in the middle, consumerism.
Well, I think business firms have done fairly well in the 80s compared to other historic periods. I think consumers have done better sometimes than consumers would actually recognize. Because we had that era of low inflation that's emerged from increases in productivity and increases in output in the economy. Standard of living for consumers has increased in the last few years. They've done well. I don't think they always recognize it because there's things like, well, air traffic safety isn't as good as it used to be, or appears to be that way. Phone rates at a local level went up. The checking account now costs more, things like that.
But inflation wasn't that strong, which says, for example, even the telephone rates being higher, it still didn't, other things were improving. In other words, it's offsetting balances that are going on in the middle.
Organized labor, of course, is the one that's really hurting. But I think that's because I think we agree it's because of an increase in service sector kind of employment and a decline in the industrial base. And service sector employees are harder to unionize.
Without any question. And you have a situation where a lot of the major industry, where it relocated, for example, in other words, it moved even just slightly south, you have a lot more reluctance to organize there than you do here. In other words, it's something that you, I think right at this point in time, I think right now the union is making a very aggressive effort to do some organizing and have not been successful in Tennessee and Kentucky with some of these new automotive plants. And so this is something that, but I have to say that the consumer, I think, has maintained position, but I think there's a lot of exchanging that's going on. Businesses have maintained position, but the structure of business, as Cecil talked about earlier, has changed. In other words, you're getting tremendous conglomerations and changes in terms of big business, small business, this sort of thing. So structurally it's changing. It's different people are gaining and other people are losing in the process.
Well, again, I mean, I think the point I want to make with respect to why consumers are doing better than they sometimes imagine, I think this is a problem associated with the whole process of deregulation. Deregulation, let's just take one example in telecommunications or in telephone services. Everyone knows that their local rates went up. No one likes to see their local rates go up.
Sure.
However, the corresponding offsetting event with respect to increases in local rates have been reductions in long-distance rates.
Because
now,
it was a subsidy.
Exactly, because long distance was subsidizing local rates.
Exactly.
Now, what benefits do consumers obtain from having a reduction in long distance rate? Well, obviously, if you want to call your mother in Oregon, it's cheaper. But I argue there's an additional benefit to the extent the cost associated with communicating information in businesses in general goes down. What that means is lower prices than would otherwise exist for consumers across the board. But that's a hidden benefit.
Yeah. And
that's a hidden benefit.
The business
that
is in a very competitive industry.
Right.
If there are one of two or three businesses in there, then they might not go down as much.
That might be the case, but I think 9 out of 10 businessmen would indicate they at least view themselves as being a fairly competitive industry, and I think most statistics indicate that's true.
That'll continue to be the trend. I mean, as you mentioned, Ralph Nader's emergence, and consumers have become a real force, just not the buyer of goods, but someone who's putting demands on the manufacturer, the producer of goods now, in terms of quality. And that's going to continue.
I'd say the consumers have maintained their sense of importance and recognition more this time. There's actually been 3 other eras of consumerism earlier in this century, but this is probably the longest running and the most stable era where consumers have maintained their stature as saying, hey, I want to read about it, I want to learn about it, but I also expect good product and this sort of thing.
Question I have for Bill. Do you think that most of the improvement in the status of consumers, let's say since Ralph Nader in 1965, how much do you think emanates from increased government regulation, government watchdogging, and how much do you think it just emanates from the fact consumers are now wealthier and more sophisticated and a lot more careful about what they're doing? Do we get better cars today because of government legislation, or are we getting better cars because consumers are more sophisticated?
I'm not sure you could really sort the two out, but I think you need both. You do need regulation, or the specter of regulation.
The threat of it?
Yes. Quite frankly, I believe that very seriously, and I think it's something that if you have that, then it makes for better self-regulation, okay? In other words, if you think as a business person that you're going to have to be subject to some sort of regulation that it's hard to ever get rid of once it's passed, then you're going to probably watch your act a little bit better.
One counter-argument, a lot of people sometimes argue that what regulation ends up becoming at a government level is a surrogate for establishing monopolies on the part of business. That is, the regulators regulate for the regulated.
Okay.
And even though they end up doing certain things that ostensibly look like they're in the consumer interest, what they really end up doing is excluding certain firms from the industry.
Well, I think that potential is built in. I don't think you can get completely away from that technology, the cost, and everything else. I think
so. And we could also
there.
say, with the emphasis upon the anti-emphasis upon protectionism, this would also be to the benefit of the consumer.
Absolutely. To the extent that's...
And that's really, it gets very complex when you talk about the protectionism issue, because you're talking about something that also affects employees who are consumers. And so it's really hard to sort that out. But yes, it is. It's pro-consumer without any question.
Sure. I think the amazing thing is not that there have been some protectionist measures put up by Congress, but the amazing and by the president in some cases, even though people don't generally perceive that. The amazing thing is we've had as much free trade in this period of massive foreign trade deficits as we've had.
Tremendous resistance to to any efforts to adjust it or protectionism, because history has shown that it really has backfired, that it actually has had more of a retaliative effect than a positive effect.
Or the final analysis, that's true. The political actors always have a short-run incentive to create new or maintain new jobs in the district. The UAW worker would much prefer not having the Toyotas in the marketplace.
Sure.
independent of what the long-run retaliatory effects were.
Crystal ball time, Cecil, for 86, for all consumers. 85, not a boom year, but certainly not a bad year economically. Stock market bullish, active. Is 86 going to be a good year for consumers?
Well, I think, again, the one thing I would use in my prognostication that makes me probably a little bit as optimistic as I think the standard consensus is the fact the stock market has gone up. The stock market constitutes, it's trite to say that it does constitute kind of barometer of confidence in the economy. And the fact the stock market has broken 1,500, I think, indicates something about what some people are thinking are going to be going on in the economy, in spite of having massive trade deficits, in spite of it looking like that the whole recovery is petering out, aside from it looking like that the money supply is growing at rapid rates. I think 86 is probably going to be a year fairly similar to 85. And, of course, that's standard wisdom. It's always easy to fall back on standard wisdom. If there's one kicker that I'm worried about, I would say it would be inflation. Inflation could make a comeback simply because of excessive monetary growth, and also because of the change in the value of the dollar. To the extent the dollar continues to decline in value, that should do something to contribute to inflation. So I would see 86 being a year similar to 85, looking at the crystal ball, but the one kicker I'm worried about is a high rate of inflation setting in.
But the movers and shakers, those with the money, those who sometimes risk their capital, they've been optimistic in it.
When Wall Street says it's over 1,500 on Dow, that says something's going right, even though other statistics might not look
Don't you really find this interesting, despite the fact that you're getting economic signals, in other words, the different barometers, the different indicators, that they're very mixed? In other words, you'll have them where they'll be up and they'll be down.
Sure.
Is the economy getting that much more complex and harder to measure? In other words, is it getting harder to anticipate what's going to happen?
I think that's an interesting hypothesis, and we've talked about this before on the show, is that to the extent the economy becomes more service-oriented and less industrial-oriented, you can't just look at General Motors and say what's good for GM is good for the United States. To the extent, in some sense, the revolution we're going through with the microchip, the revolution we're going through with the, quote, deindustrialization of America is actually making wealth and economic power more dispersed. Any one measure of the well-being of the economy is not as reliable as it was 30 years ago. Probably 30 years ago, you could look at housing starts and that'd tell you what's going to happen.
Right.
To the extent things are more dispersed now, it's not at all clear that's true.
If you look at what really happened in terms of the stock market, isn't it really the fact that OPEC has a lot less power, and that's a real boost to the whole economic picture?
Well, I'm suspicious of any report that
barrel of oil is going down. And
well,
so
sure, that cannot hurt us. That cannot hurt us. There's no way having cheaper energy costs can be bad for the economy, and there's no question that's contributing to a continuation of the recovery. You're absolutely right. That's an important factor. But I'm always suspicious of any unicausal factor for increases in the stock market in general, in that when you read in the front page of the newspaper, the stock market went up because of this, this, and this. Who knows why the stock market went up? In general, the stock market went up because people wanted to buy securities. And they want to buy securities for whatever reason. I don't know why those millions of people wanted to buy securities. My suspicion is, for whatever reason, it indicates a certain level of general confidence in the economy that has to be a positive sign.
Well, whenever it fluctuates based on the president's health or what he said that day,
that's
obviously
right. I mean,
it's reactive to...
Well, we don't know. I mean, I hate to, again, talk about journalists, but journalist interpretation of stock market prices changes aren't exactly 100% accurate, nor are economists, so I'll get myself on the hook, off the hook there.
86 is a political year, John Rouse. You'd mentioned earlier about running without Reagan. In fact, Reagan is somewhat of a lame duck in reality, if not as a matter of practice, as a Republican, a party leader, a legislative leader. But 86 will be the sort of beginning of the end of the Reagan era for Republicans.
Yeah, I think so. He's been called the Teflon president. I think we could say that the negatives rub off as well as the positives, the separation of the positions or the policies from the personality. I think I said a few minutes ago that there are 15 Republicans who are up for first termers, where there are actually 15, not 16. It's the first time that they'll have to run these 15 without Ronald Reagan at the top. 22 of the 34 seats, again, belong to Republicans. The polls indicate, for example, that the Republicans do very well at managing the economy and also handling foreign policy. The polls also indicate that the Democrats do well at helping the poor, providing jobs for the unemployed, providing quality education, protecting the environment, and also protecting American jobs. What the public seems to like about Democrats at the national level, dislike about Democrats at the national level, taxing and spending, they like about Democrats at the local level, which is protecting and providing.
People want a Republican president, but a Democratic congressman.
Right.
Right.
Or that tends to be the case in the last several years. So if you look at the Democrats in the governor's offices, you'd say, well, Democrats can manage the states, but why cannot the Democrats put up good candidates lately in terms of contesting for the White House? The answer is, I think, that the Democratic Party never has gotten over Vietnam. If you look at the candidates of the Democratic Party prior to Vietnam versus after Vietnam, McGovern, Carter, and also Mondale versus Lyndon Johnson, John Kennedy, Harry Truman, and so forth. And so the issue, as we go into '86, we're looking at an election that involves 34 candidates that are basically, in a way, independent of the past. Certainly we look at the years of 1958, when the Republicans lost 48 seats in the House, in 1974 when they lost 48 seats, in '82 when the Republicans lost 26 seats in the House. The Democrats in 1962 lost 4 seats. In 1966, their year of Vietnam, lost 47 seats. In 1978, lost 15 seats. So if you look at 1968, Democrats lost 47, middle of Vietnam. 1974, the Republicans lost 48 seats, middle of Watergate. 1958 was the middle of the recession. At that time, the Republicans also lost 48 seats.
Well, we're not in the middle of anything right now. What we have here are 22 Republican senators who were elected in 1980 when Ronald Reagan won his first term as president. And they're running now pretty much on their own at the top of the ticket, which means that what ought to happen, given traditional political trends, is that Democrats win the Senate. Is that going to happen?
No, I don't think it's going to happen, but I think, you want a projection? 50-50, Bush is going to break the tie.
Interesting.
And what you're going to have, whether you have Republicans control the Senate or Democrats control the Senate, you're going to have a much more pragmatic, quote, moderate Senate going on there.
So you're saying the difference between Republicans and Democrats are waning at a national level?
Oh, yeah, I definitely think so. I mean, what has happened is that more people pay attention to the evening news than they do going out to organize politically. It does not mean, on the other hand, that political parties are not important in terms of organization. Keep in mind the 3 important things that you have to have.
Quickly.
Numbers, organization, brain power, and especially money. And if you don't have those, you can't do
Public Affairs Roundtable, believe it or not. Thanks to our panelists, Bill Mosher, Cecil Bohannon, and John Rouse. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.
If you have comments regarding this program, please address them to John Rouse, Box 149, Muncie, Indiana 47305. The producer for Public Affairs Roundtable is John Rouse. Associate producers are Cecil Bohannon and Bill Mosher. This program is a production of University Media Services, the Department of Political Science.